You're listening to Inside the Village, where all news is local and no topic is off limits.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley. Hey, bully in the alley. So help me, Bob.
Welcome to Inside the Village, brought to you by True North Mortgage. True North Mortgage, where you'll get great value and save a pile of cash. You can find out more at truenorthmortgage.ca with Michael Friscolanti, the editor-in-chief here at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Welcome back to another episode.
Good to see you, Scott. It's September. I'm very excited.
It is September, and it's day, I've lost count, 85 of beard growth since you've seen the clippers.
Yeah, I cannot find the clippers. They're still in a box somewhere, and we've been searching frantically for them, but I'm getting used to it. I think I like it.
I will leave it at that. How's the move going, by the way? You close?
Not even. Not even close.
Not even. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
It's going to be Christmas. We're going to still be tired. But I can go as Santa. I'll dye it white and go to the mall, and it'll be perfect.
Subsidize your income.
That's right.
The first word to Frisco on this Wednesday. As always, we like to highlight the great local journalism that's being done across the Village Media Network and highlight a few of those examples. And, of course, the big story coming out of late last week after 70 years as the monarch, the passing of Queen Elizabeth II.
Of course, it's the biggest story in the world, right? And it's not lost on local news. I have to say our sites have done an amazing job of localizing that story, whether it was bringing to life some of the old archival footage or archival pieces of, say, the Queen's visit to Sault Ste. Marie in 1959, kind of bringing those old photos and stories back to life. A lot of our sites did that kind of thing, or the Aurelia artist who painted a famous portrait, a famous painting of the Queen riding a moose,
right.
about like 50 years ago, and then decades later he met the Queen and told her how that he made his whole life based on that painting. His whole career was based on the success of that painting. I guess it went viral at the time. It was in newspapers all over the world. I had never heard of it, so it was an interesting read on Aurelia Matters. We had Sean Gibson, one of our reporters in Barrie, write a real heartfelt piece about losing the Queen, him having grown up with the influence of his family, talking about how important the Queen was, and so it hit him pretty hard. Andrew Phillips, our editor in Midland, wrote a great column about covering the Queen's tour in Canada in 2002, so that's 20 years ago. So, it was one of those things where obviously it's not a local story, but it is a local story because
Absolutely.
Everyone has a connection to the Queen.
I'm curious to see. We always hear the expression that it's weddings and funerals that bring family or disconnected loved ones together. Interesting for me to see William and Harry with their wives back after a bit of a falling out, and I'm curious what your take may be on.
Yeah.
Is this the mending of fences that could be in the works?
I'm going to be 100% honest. I have very little interest in what the Royals do. No, I don't. It's not something I understand why people do have a lot of interest in it, right? Yep. I had a colleague. I'll give a shout out to Patricia Treble, my old colleague at Maclean's, who's one of the great Canadian royal commenters, and she's fantastic. We should have her on the show. Actually,
we should.
time.
Yeah, let's do that.
And we used to talk daily about the Royals in the newsroom there, and not something that really interests me. But I have to say, I read that coverage about the two couples together again, because you've seen all the rift and the Oprah interview and all that stuff. To see them walking, I couldn't take my eyes off that. I was watching it. I watched the footage of it. I read multiple articles about it, and it's crazy how that'll fascinate you, right?
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears and move to Guelph. There's an 8-year-old that has quite the battle that he's facing today.
Yeah, another great example of great local journalism. It's a very sad story, but it's shining a light on an issue. The mother of this 8-year-old boy, this 8-year-old Joseph Saliba, suffers from children's Alzheimer's, is what it's known as. Mm-hmm. And he's basically losing his memory. His motor skills are going down. And it's a very rare disorder. It strikes about 1 in 70,000 people. Wow. And there's this young boy in Guelph that suffers from this, and his mother wanted to raise awareness. Taylor Pace, one of our reporters there, wrote a beautiful story about him. And it's had a lot of attention. And again, it's one of those stories where, local journalism at its best, I think. It's a really powerful piece.
Yeah, great work by Taylor and the team in Guelph. And finally, a bit of a lighter story. Tell us about Chicken Man out of Halton Hills.
I'm going to be biased, Scott, but this is one of my favorite kind of stories, okay? This is the story that I, as a journalist, you always say, I wish I did this story. I wish I wrote this story because it's so good. So, Menster Tenweir in Halton Hills today, there's a local brewery in Georgetown that has a beer called the Chicken Man, I think it was. Is that what it was?
Yeah,
Chicken
I believe
Man?
so. Yeah.
And it's based on this local legend of a guy who used to ride around on his bike with a basket in the back and a chicken in it.
But it wasn't a chicken.
Yeah, it wasn't chicken. So, but this is the best part. So they named the beer, and he died 8 years ago. This guy,
Right.
he was not a very well-known guy, but it was a legend around Georgetown, right? And this brewery has this beer, and so Mansour was telling us the backstory of who this guy was, and so it was like he was doing like a deep dive investigative piece of journalism. It's amazing, right? He found old family, friends, talked to the people at the brewery, found old photographs. Turns out it wasn't a chicken. It was a hen that he had in the back. He used to get angry when people would say it was a chicken. But if you have time to Google this story, the Halton Hills Today piece about the Chicken Man, it is just so well done. He went and tracked down his childhood home in a different city where he was buried. He had a photo. He had the guy who stores his old bike. Again, he died 8 years ago.
Wow.
And his bike, he took a picture of the guy with his bike. It is just a classic urban legend, and everyone knows in town who the Chicken Man is. But this story tells you who the Chicken Man was. It's just amazing.
And the hen's name was Cluck Cluck.
Cluck Cluck.
Cluck Cluck the hen.
How did I miss that detail?
The first word to Frisco. All right, coming up in our next segment of Inside the Village, we'll be joined by David Macdonald, a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We'll talk inflation, interest rates, and so much more. It's next on Inside the Village.
From newsmakers to celebrities to other prominent guests, you'll find them all on Village Media's new interview series, Up Close and Personal. Join host Scott Sexsmith as he goes one-on-one with well-known Canadians to hear their story. Up Close and Personal. Look for it on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Welcome back to Inside the Village. I'm Scott Sexsmith with Michael Friscolanti, editor-in-chief here at Village Media. Well, interest rates, inflation, Bank of Canada back in the news again with interest rates going up 75 basis points.
It's still the story that everyone's talking about, right? Everyone's concerned about the economy. We've talked about this before. We've gone from dealing with the pandemic to coming out of it, and now everyone has huge concerns about potential recessions, about the cost of their mortgages going through the roof. And now the Bank of Canada is trying to deal with the inflation by another 75 basis points, 0.75%. They raised the interest rate, and a lot of ramifications of that, right? And then some experts question whether this is the right strategy, whether it's to keep these interest rates going to try to get a handle on inflation. The Bank of Canada says it's the way forward, what they have to do, and there's other people that don't think it is the right way forward.
We're going to be joined by David Macdonald from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in a sec here. Let me ask you, though, Frisco, have you noticed in your household your own personal shopping practices and the way that your household operates? Has it changed much?
100%. I mean, we grocery shop together as if like different. I grocery shop, my wife grocery shops. You see the prices at the store. I do find myself. I've always kind of been the kind of guy that will look through flyers and make sure I know what I'm doing.
Yeah,
but you're doing it. You're making sure you're doing it. Just being more careful about what you buy. Even the kids' hockey equipment, like buying hockey equipment for the kids. Usually, and I could be dead wrong about this, but usually in August there's hockey sales, right? Sport Check has a hockey sale. I shouldn't criticize Sport Check in general, but there's hockey sale. I didn't see those at all this summer. I don't know if they just decided, you know what, the cost of the inflation is just too high. We're not going to put this stuff on sale. And I don't know what happened, but there was no sale on the hockey equipment. So you're careful on what you're buying on that front too. You're noticing these things, and honestly, Scott, people are concerned about. This is what people are talking about, right? They're talking about the cost of living and what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I've a couple of comments. First of all, I've noticed that gas prices have dropped significantly in the last week to 10 days. Northern Ontario was around 165 now. I think 151 to 154, depending on where you are. And a lot of talk too about supply chain and supply chain issues that seem to be correcting over time. But I don't know about you. I walk into stores and I'm still seeing shelves that are empty.
Oh yeah, there's things like that you just don't see anymore. My wife uses a certain kind of almond milk for her coffee, and most of the time it's not there anymore. So it's just weird things that just aren't there, right? And I think too the shock of the interest rates on people's variable mortgages hasn't clicked in yet, right? That people don't realize how much more they're going to pay, or they haven't seen it yet, whether their mortgage is up for renewal in a year or whether it's up for renewal in a couple months, or they had a variable. And so this kind of sticker shock maybe hasn't hit people yet, and it's coming.
Well, let's find out from the expert and see what he has to say. We're now joined by David Macdonald, a senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. David, welcome to Inside the Village. Great to have you here today.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, David. And I think we need to make clear off the top, we're not an economics podcast. So we're going to do our best to ask you some questions that make sense. But we appreciate you coming on and being able to talk about some issues that maybe our readers and our listeners aren't completely aware of. So we apologize in advance for some dumb questions, David. But can we just kind of start by speaking in general? I think a lot of people don't even understand sort of what's driving the inflation right now. Can you talk about that? What are some of the things coming together for this perfect storm?
Yeah, I mean, this was really kicked off with the war in Ukraine, which has been going on, for 6 odd months now, but also with higher oil prices prior to that. And so this is where things really kicked off, is the price of oil went through the roof with the war in Ukraine because Russia is a big supplier of oil to world markets, and they got cut off from those world markets as we stopped buying oil from them. We didn't actually buy a lot of oil from Russia, but Europe buys a lot of oil from Russia, and they stopped buying a lot of that oil. Compounding the problem was that there was a fair amount of refining capacity in the U.S. that was shut down because of COVID. So this is like you get raw oil and you turn it into gas you can put in your car. Some of these big plants shut down in the U.S. because people weren't driving it, so they didn't need gas. As we swung into late last year, it became evident that several of those plants weren't reopening because it's not just a little flip the switch. I mean, these are big plants, and the refining capacity wasn't going to come back online. And so you get this double whammy of higher oil prices, which is going to drive, which is the main component of gas. And then the refining capacity is also constrained. And so you just get less gas being produced, gasoline for your car. And so this was one of the starting factors in inflation. But of course, everything runs on oil and natural gas, and not natural gas, but oil or derivatives thereof. So gasoline, diesel. And so these things start to bake themselves into other prices. So all of a sudden, it takes more, in diesel costs to drive your food across the country. And so food prices start to go up. And in addition to the fact that we were actually reopening, and people who were spending a lot of money on goods over the course of the pandemic because they didn't have any services to spend things on because things were closed, were switching back to services. So they could go back out to eat. They could go on vacation. And so the price, say, of hotels and the price of airline tickets goes through the roof. I think many of the industries just weren't prepared for this rush that happened, starting last year, but really in earnest this summer. And so as a result, you get, anybody who tried to fly this summer or over the past 6 months, been a total nightmare. Everything's getting lost. All the flights are getting rerouted and stuff because we're not flying the same amount of planes as we used to. So this is part of the story, to be sure. And so, let's leave it there. I mean, those are sort of the initial driving factors. And so now we're at, we're at 7.6% inflation now is the most recent data from July. We're going to get the August figures in a week or so's time. They'll likely be somewhat lower because gas prices have fallen a fair amount. Gas prices in June were in the $2.20 a liter to $2.30, $2.40, depending on where you were. Now we're into the $1.40, $1.50 a liter. So it's a lot cheaper. And gas is volatile. And so this will be one of the factors that will likely, it's not going to be 2% inflation, but it'll probably be in the sort of 7% range instead of 7.6, which is where we're at right now.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned being caught off guard. Is it fair to ask if the Bank of Canada was kind of caught off guard? Should they not have seen this inflation coming?
Well, I mean, it's inflation driven by a war in Ukraine and refining capacity in the U.S. And so, certainly the Bank of Canada's interest rate can have a lot of impact on some parts of the CPI index. Think of like the housing market, the price of houses, price of renovations, price of major appliances, right? These are definitely things that if people aren't making money on houses, those sectors tank. And so, it's cheaper to buy a house, right? And we're seeing that to some degree. I mean, we've seen an increase in the overnight rate from the Bank of Canada, and therefore we're seeing decreases in housing prices. The decrease in the price of gas since June has zero to do with what's happening for the Bank of Canada. And so, it's one of the dilemmas of the Bank of Canada is that some sectors are very interest rate sensitive. And others aren't interest rate sensitive at all. The energy sector is because these prices aren't set here. The price of gas isn't set here. I mean, the interest rate from the Bank of Canada could be 10%. It would make no difference to the price of gas because it's not set here. It might make a marginal difference insofar as we get a recession and people are unemployed, and so they have to buy less gas because they're not driving to work. But there's other sectors that are really be driving the decrease in inflation, which is an average of prices. I mean, there's nothing magical about inflation. It's just an average of all the things that we buy. We buy a lot of gas, but houses are really expensive, even though we don't buy a lot of them. We don't buy them very often. But that also has a major impact as the price of housing.
I've read some of your reports on the rapid interest rate hikes we're seeing and whether they're good or bad. Obviously, you have some opinions on this. Well, what do you think in terms of the strategy that the Bank of Canada is taking right now?
Yeah, I mean, the history is not in our favor here. So any time where we have covered the distance we need to cover now from, 8% inflation down to 2% inflation, we've done it with a recession. So, I mean, the idea here is that there's a soft landing, or there's a scenario where there's a soft landing, which is to say we get inflation back down to 2% without a recession, without major job loss. There's just no historical precedent for that. I mean, it's a good idea. I mean, I think that we should try, but I don't think it's very likely, or historically, it certainly hasn't been very likely. And so that's been one of my great concerns, is that particularly if we rely on interest rates exclusively to get us there, because it's a very blunt instrument, right? I mean, interest rates affects everything. Like, it's not very targeted. We know the price of housing is very high, but we're not targeting the price of housing per se. We're targeting, I mean, yes, housing will be affected by this, but there's a whole bunch of other industries that are going to be affected by it as well. So people are going to lose work, making appliances. Well, we don't really want that, even if we want the price of houses to come down. And so really, there's been very little interest federally or provincially for governments to attempt to deal with high prices where they have a lot of power. I'm not saying set the price of meat. I'm saying, like, where you have a lot of power to change particular criteria, governments aren't utilizing that power. So, for instance, federally, the Bank of Canada sets the government of Canada sets the rules for mortgage underwriting. Investors have been some of the major drivers of increases in house prices, which makes up part of the reason why the CPI is going up. You could target them. You could target investors specifically and say, look, you want to buy a house as investment property? Great. You've got to put 50% down, not 20% down. And so anyway, that is a broad way of saying that my concern is that we're going to end up with a recession instead of a soft landing.
David Macdonald is our guest, a senior economist from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. David, if we can just shift gears for a second here and talk about wages for a sec. We're hearing recently about unions getting some pretty good deals, much better deals than we're typically used to hearing between the 4% and 6% wage increases. Some would say that is unheard of. What do you think are the ramifications of those deals?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because wages are going up. I mean, you see average wage rates are absolutely going up. And frankly, if these wage rates had been happening in 2017, we'd think, holy cow, I mean, this is really like historically high wage gains. The trouble is that they're still way behind inflation. So even if you got a wage increase, I mean, the average wage increase with the latest labor force survey is basically 5.5%. 5.5% year over year would be pretty decent in 2016. The trouble is that inflation is 7.5%. And so even if you're making these wage gains, you're still falling behind, which is saying something, which shows you that, there's still a 2 percentage point gap between where inflation's at and where workers are at. And so, you can work the same amount you worked last year, but you're still going to be buying 2% less stuff because your real wages have fallen, in essence. There's three big reasons why inflation, or what could be driving up inflation. One of them is certainly wages. I mean, that's certainly a plausible scenario, right? Workers are asking for 10% wage increases. And so once that filters through the economy, we get 7% inflation. That's actually not what's happening. We're seeing nowhere near 10% wage increases for workers. The second one is supply chain issues, or like input prices, which is primarily what's driving this, right? It's the high price of oil and the high price of its derivatives, gasoline and diesel, in addition to supply chain issues. But the supply chain issues themselves have been sort of sorted out in the last GDP numbers. We're seeing record high inventory buildups in Canada. So finally stuff is coming in essence from the ports. The goods are coming in. There's less demand for goods and more demand for services. But the third one is higher corporate profits. I mean, this is the other reason why inflation can be going up. Of course, workers and consumers don't set prices. Businesses set prices. And so insofar as you've got industries where there isn't a lot of competition, and there's plenty of those, you can make higher margins. And so we are seeing record high margins in Canada. We're seeing certainly record high profits. But more interestingly, we're seeing record high capture of GDP, the size of our economy, in corporate profit. So if you imagine sort of the economy as a battle between corporate profits and workers' wages, that balance has shifted to historically high levels on the corporate profit side. And it's in industries where, it's not a surprise why these industries are making so much money. It is oil and gas extraction. It is petroleum manufacturing, oil refining into gasoline. We're a net exporter of gasoline to the US, so we benefit from this, higher gas prices, or industry benefit from it. The banks and the real estate industries. Those are sort of the big industries that are winning from this in record high corporate profits. And so, there's always a focus on whether workers' wages are driving inflation. They've remained well behind inflation. Workers are taking one for the team. They're taking one for corporate profits, in essence, at this point. And until they sort of capture and exceed actual inflation, so that they're not losing money year over year, they I don't think can be pointed to as the drivers of inflation. They are the victims of inflation at this point.
Mm-hmm. They have a bit of bargaining power as well because of the labor shortage, David. Is that accurate? I mean, we keep hearing, in Thunder Bay, for example, the last dry cleaner in Thunder Bay just closed because they don't have any workers that they can hire to work at the dry cleaners. So you think if you're a worker right now, the ball's in your court in terms of getting a better wage or better working conditions. Is that not happening?
Yeah, there's been a historic change in terms of job vacancies versus unemployed workers. So you go back to, say, 2016, which was a strong labor market. Wasn't like we're seeing today, but back then you would have 6 unemployed people competing for every job vacancy. So a 6-to-1 ratio, right? Heavily weighted against workers, right? Like you're competing against other people that are unemployed trying to get a job. It's 1-to-1 now. So we have 1 million unemployed workers, 1 million job vacancies, which change a bit month to month, but it's a 1-to-1 ratio now. And so prior to, about a year or two ago, you could expect, 6 applications per job posting. Now you'd expect 1 on average. And if your job is at minimum wage and the hours are kind of miserable and it's not really a great job, then you could expect 0. And so that's the real change, is that we're at parity, right? It's kind of a historic change, is that, workers have more power and they are driving up wages in a nominal sense. Like wage gains have been 5.4% is most recent data year over year, which would be considered decent in other years. But when you're comparing it to inflation, you're still, losing. And so what's interesting is what's interesting is when you look at the comparison between what the minimum amount workers would seek to become employed, like what are workers looking for? If you're looking for a job, what are you looking for? You can compare that by industry to what are employers offering in their job postings, right? And you can say, in a particular industry, is the issue that employers just aren't offering enough for whatever reason? Maybe they can't offer enough because they can't raise their own prices, so they don't think they can. But see, that's not a labor shortage, right? That's a wage shortage, which is different than a labor shortage where you legitimately can't get the people with the skills needed to fill your position. The biggest industries where you're seeing the wages being offered by employers at substantially less than what the unemployed folks looking for jobs are willing to accept is in retail and food and accommodation, which those 2 sectors alone represents a quarter of all job vacancies. And the wages are too low by about 20% from what workers are seeking. So workers have power, and the 1-to-1 ratio means they can shop around. And if you're offering minimum wage and somebody else across the street who's offering $16 or $17 an hour, well, it makes it more competitive. So it's a very different environment from hiring now than it is pre-pandemic, although there's more people working now than there was pre-pandemic. So it's not as if there are sort of fewer people working. It's just that there's a lot more postings than there was pre-pandemic.
This may be an unfair question because you don't have a crystal ball like anybody else, but this is the issue that everyone I talk to is worried about, right, David? They're concerned about the increased cost of living. They're concerned about prices at the grocery store, and they're concerned about this looming possibility of a recession. They're just worried in general. We went from worrying about the pandemic, now we're worried about the economy. What kind of comfort can you give people, if any, or what do you think is going to happen in the next year?
And how worried should we be?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, on the one side, the employment picture is very good. I mean, if you are looking for a job right now, it is a great time to look for a job in Canada. The unemployment rate has gone up since the lows that we saw earlier in the summer. But other things being said, it's a very competitive environment. There's a lot of job postings, and it's a good time to look for a job. Now, are you going to see wage increases over the rate of inflation? Yeah, probably not. I think the real danger over the next year is that ever increasing interest rates from the Bank of Canada will lead us into a recession. I mean, that's something that we talked about earlier in the show. And so that's something that I would really keep an eye on, and one of my big concerns. That being said, I mean, the employment picture is reasonably good, and we'll see. The real question is how many jobs have to be lost, sacrificed, sort of, to get back down to 2%. Is sort of the question in my mind. There's always the debate that it's positive that we have such low unemployment going into a rate tightening cycle, and I mean, in sort of the macroeconomic sense, it is. In the more micro sense, like, people are going to lose work over this, and it's going to be tough on them. And so, is that 300,000 people? Is it 1 million people? It's fine to talk about the fact that, well, some people have to lose their jobs to get unemployment down, to get inflation down. I mean, that may be true if you're not the one losing your job.
David, just to follow up on that, we talk about, how worried should we be? 2 questions. How worried are you? And as an economist, have you seen the high inflation at 7.6% affect your own spending habits and how you're operating day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I'm worried about a recession. That's sort of my big worry, is that governments aren't that interested in attempting to constrain prices, and so they're going to leave it to the Bank of Canada. And the Bank of Canada has used a sledgehammer, and as they have before. And we'll get to 2%. We'll just get there at sort of terrible cost. Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of my own experience this summer, I always go out east for a vacation in the summer, and it was certainly not something I was going to fly to do. I mean, we drove, which is sort of more expensive than we generally have it. So we definitely stayed within the country this year in terms of trying to fly outside of the country. But, these disruptions are real, and they're really affecting people's lives and their ability to travel. Try to rent a car in PEI, good luck, $2,000 a week, right? It's a total mess. So, I mean, that, I'm certainly concerned for the future. And we'll see. We'll have to keep watching the rate hikes and see whether they continue to rise above this. They're above the 3% level, so the bank is actively reducing economic growth now. We'll see if they keep going towards 4 or 5%, and I think we'll really be in a pickle.
Last question for me, David. Thanks so much for all your time. Pierre Poilievre just elected the leader of the Conservatives. Justin Trudeau's Liberals talking a lot about inflation, about the cost of living. This is the main issue that everyone's talking about, right? As the weeks go on, what should the average person in Canada be watching for, or making sure they're listening for, in terms of what's realistic for a politician to be able to do in this scenario to deal with inflation, what's not?
Yeah, I mean, the latest government package of supports, these don't reduce inflation, but they help lower income households afford higher prices. I mean, this is the one-time transfer to the GST tax credit, plus sort of 2 other measures, one on dental care, one on rental assistance. And so, these are positive measures. There are certainly things governments can and should be doing that don't even necessarily cost money. The competition, beefing up the Competition Bureau is one, changing mortgage rules is another federally. Provincially, frankly, there's a lot more that you could do. I mean, on things like tuition fees, on transit fees, on regulated rental price increases. I mean, these are all things that all these individual prices are in the CPI average, right? The official CPI average. And you can attempt to reduce them by targeting them. Childcare is an example of, if you've got young kids in childcare, you've got negative inflation in essence this year because the prices will have dropped so much. So there are certainly things that governments can and should be doing. I haven't seen a tremendous amount in terms of trying to target prices more specifically. We're seeing a bit provincially, but it'd be good to see more of that as opposed to offsetting the increase in prices after the fact. Not necessarily, not that I'm against that, but that's really been the approach so far from governments.
David Macdonald, Senior Economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Thanks for doing this today, David. Appreciate the insight and the perspective.
Reporters, editors, and journalists who go the extra mile to get the story and get it right. Go behind the scenes with those who cover the stories that matter most to you and your community. Look for it in the Village Features section of your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
We're back on Inside the Village with Michael Friscoletti, Editor-in-Chief at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Hey, we're 5 or 6 weeks away from municipal elections, starting to see all kinds of lawn signs and advertisements popping up. But I guess it's also a busy time for everyone in our newsrooms as well.
You know, the one thing I've noticed since I've come on board here, this is my first kind of job in the local news industry, right? And even when I was covering at other newsrooms, I didn't really cover too many elections. It wasn't the thing that I did.
Sure.
So it's been really cool to see how our local teams tackle the municipal elections. It's one of the biggest things we cover, right? People care very deeply about what's going on in their communities and who's being elected. And I've noticed that every site kind of does it a little bit differently, but really well. So we have a lot of great candidate profiles coming through the pipe right now that we're covering that people can read now on our sites. We're tackling different issues. We're challenging candidates on certain things that are happening. And we're doing some tough reporting too. We had the Guelph Today team did a piece on a candidate who was running for municipal council, asking some tough questions about some previous comments he'd made, homophobic, sexist remarks he'd made online, and he actually dropped out of the race.
Wow.
as they were asking the questions. So some hard-hitting reporting too going on, as we always do. So it's been really cool to watch that unfold. And I'm to be honest, I'm kind of watching from the background and learning myself about how best to cover these elections, but very exciting time for us for sure.
Very cool. You've got a great team, and I can't wait to follow the coverage. Inside the Village is brought to you by True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. You can find out more at truenorthmortgage.ca. Frisco and I will be back next Wednesday.
We'll be there.
Looking forward to it. Inside the Village can be found back episodes at insidethevillage.ca, anywhere you get your favorite podcasts, and of course across the Village Media Network. For Michael Friscoletti, Editor-in-Chief at Village Media, I'm Scott Sexsmith. Have a great week. We'll talk to you next Wednesday.
You've been listening to Inside the Village.